Welcome to Going Deeper. This past Sunday was, of course, Easter Sunday or Resurrection Sunday, and as a church we looked at one of the very famous passages in John chapter 20 regarding Jesus being at the tomb or not being at the tomb when the ladies went that first morning, and an angel had rolled the stone away and said, "He's not here." And the ladies went back and they shared with the disciples that Jesus had risen. Well, Jesus made several appearances after His resurrection, and not all of them were to everyone at one time who were followers. And on some occasions, some of the disciples weren't present, especially in John chapter 20. I'm going to look at a man by the name of Thomas. Thomas wasn't there when Jesus revealed Himself after the resurrection. The ladies had seen the angel. They had been told that Jesus was alive. There were these encounters with Him, but Thomas had not yet seen the risen Christ. And so the Bible says that shortly after Jesus had presented Himself to some of the disciples, Thomas shows up. And it's in John chapter 20, verse 24. The Bible says, "But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to Him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But He said to them, 'Unless I see His hands, the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into His side, I will not believe.'" Now, at first blush, at first glance, it looks like Thomas is living up to the name that he's been given over the last couple thousand years. People have said and called him Doubting Thomas. And so when someone tells you something, and or if you've ever heard someone call someone else that's where it comes from. It comes from Thomas saying, "I need to see the nail prints in His hands. I need to see for myself the marks that the crucifixion left on Him." And he said, "If not, I'm not going to believe." And that really gives Thomas a bad rap, because you think this is a guy who has no faith at all. But that's really not the case. If you go back to John chapter 11, Lazarus had died, and Jesus is saying, "We need to go to Lazarus because he's asleep." And well, he's not asleep, he's really dead. And Jesus is going to do one of His greatest works. He's going to raise him from the dead. And Thomas says in John chapter 11, verse 16, he says, "Let us go so that we may die with Him." Now, Thomas is saying, let's go. Let's go to Lazarus. There had been a lot of reports that people wanted Jesus dead. And so for Him to get that close to Jerusalem was going to put Him in harm's way. And Thomas is willing to die for Jesus. He stands up when really none of the other disciples want to go. He's saying, let us go and let us die with Him. And so it doesn't fit the narrative that Thomas is this doubting Thomas. He's just saying, I'm all in when I know what's going on. When I really knew what was going on, I was willing to die for Jesus. Now he doesn't know what to think. Jesus had just been put to death. Everything that he thought for 3.5 years didn't happen the exact way he thought it was. So yes, he is spinning and reeling from this event, and he doesn't know what to think. But he says to the other disciples, he doesn't mince words, "I need to see." So in verse 25, or verse 26, it says, "After 8 days, His disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. And Jesus came, and the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst, and said," so in other words, He comes through a locked door in a closed building. And He says to them, "Peace be with you." Then He said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger, and see my hands. And reach here with your hand, and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing." The Bible says that He meets Thomas where he is. And yes, Jesus calls out his unbelief. But He's not just a man full of unbelief. He was very much like the other disciples. He didn't know what to think anymore. And after this encounter, in verse 28, Thomas answered and he said to Him, to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, Jesus says to Thomas these words. He says, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who did not see and yet believed. I think two things are happening here. One is, I think Jesus understood where Thomas was coming from. Thomas needed to see, and plus Jesus had already revealed himself to the other disciples. It was only a matter of time before he was going to make himself present reveal himself in his presence to Thomas. So he answers his request. Thomas needs to see. But then Jesus says to Thomas, Thomas, you needed to see, and I provided what you needed. But blessed, the people who are going to believe in me later on, who've never seen what you get to see, they're going to be blessed. Church, this is the deepest part, I think, of this teaching. And that's that Thomas got to see something we didn't get to see. And yet 2,000 years later, we still have faith in Jesus. And the Bible says, if we can believe, though not seeing, we are blessed. Maybe you have a bad day. Maybe you feel like, oh, nothing's going my way. I can't believe this is happening to me. Put all that aside for just a moment and remember, because you have believed in the risen Christ, you are blessed. It has changed your destiny, and it can change the destiny of all those who come into contact with you.